The goal of this video is to give you a general overview of international climate change politics so that you can follow the developments in a knowledgeable way. First, I will introduce you to the key players and institutions of international climate politics, including the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Conference of the Parties, which is commonly referred to as COP or COP, and the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'd like you to understand who the players are and what role these players have in international climate politics. I would also like you to be able to describe some of the key agreements that have been negotiated at the international level. These include the Kyoto Protocol, the Doha Amendment, and the Paris Agreement. I'll give you a bit of a historic overview of how these agreements came about and what the effects of these agreements have been. In addition to knowing the basic content of these agreements, I also want you to understand the general processes for how these agreements are negotiated. You'll see that it's quite an involved process. So the last thing we want to talk about is the differences between mitigation and adaptation to climate change. By the end of this lecture, you should know the differences between the two terms and, of course, be able to provide examples. Since our discussion of the physical aspects of climate change has been a while ago, let's start with a quick review of the key facts. First, we have seen that the climate is changing, and we can conclusively say that the observed changes in this climate are human-caused. The process that is responsible for the observed changes is relatively simple. The human-caused or anthropogenic emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases causes the natural greenhouse gas, greenhouse effect, to trap more energy. So there is this natural greenhouse effect that the planet has, but the humans are increasing that greenhouse effect. And this causes the greenhouse effect to trap more energy in the atmosphere, which pushes our climate towards warmer and more extreme conditions. Now, it's necessary to remember that the greenhouse effect itself is natural, and that there are both natural and human causes that can force the climate to change. Now, if you don't remember this or you have questions about this, I'd recommend that you revisit the lectures on the physical aspects of climate change that we talked about near the beginning of the course. There are two key facts that I want you to remember about atmospheric CO2 concentrations. The average atmospheric concentration of CO2 is around 416 parts per million right now. And this level of CO2 in the atmosphere is unprecedented in the last 800,000 years. So it's a big deal. Unfortunately, it's not only the concentration of CO2 that's unprecedented, but also the rate of change. So the speed of the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere is also unprecedented in the history of the Earth. Even though the observed increase in the global average temperature so far is less than 1 degree Celsius, and this might not seem like a lot, but the effects on systems on the planet, and these systems that are critical for humans, such as water resources and agriculture, can already be observed. So the changes are causing real effects now. The situation, therefore, is a bit dire, and in January 2020, a group of scientists around Professor William Ripple from the Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society at Oregon State published an open access article with the title, World Scientists Warning of a Climate Emergency. Now, of course, there are lots of articles out there that warn about the consequences of climate change, but the special thing about this article is that it was signed by more than 11,000 scientists, including some profs from SFU. It's a short article and definitely worth checking out. Now, before we get into the details of the politics and climate change politics, I would also like to tie this back to the Sustainable Development Goals, where goal number 13 is dedicated to climate action. I don't expect you to know all the objectives of Goal 13, which are listed on this slide. I simply include this slide here as background information to highlight how everything we've been talking about in the course is tying together. Okay, so that's sort of the background and introduction to this topic, so let's get into the heart of the subject. The foundation of the international climate change politics is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. So the UNFCCC is an international environmental treaty that was negotiated at the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, and we talked about this a little bit in the first lecture on sustainability and the Rio Summit. Now, the objective of the convention is to, quote, stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, end of quote. Now, it's interesting to know at the time when the Framework Convention was negotiated, there was no agreement on what prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference actually means. So it's important to realize that the Framework Convention itself does not set binding limits for greenhouse gas emissions, nor does it have any enforcement mechanisms. It simply defines the rules for how specific treaties with binding limits can be negotiated. Now, these treaties are called protocols. And there are many initiatives and forums that bring together leaders and key stakeholders from all around the world to discuss climate change challenges. But the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, is the only international climate policy venue with broad legitimacy because all of the world's countries have signed on to it. To track progress, the signatory nations of the convention, which are referred to as parties, meet every year at the Conference of Parties, or COP, COP. And they discuss progress, or lack thereof, and negotiate next steps. The conferences are numbered. So we had COP1 in Berlin in 1995, COP2 in 1996 in Geneva, COP3 in Kyoto, and so on. Last year's conference in Madrid was COP25, which was supposed to be hosted in Chile, but civil unrest in Chile forced them to move the conference to another place, so Madrid stepped in. The conference in the the conference for 2020, COP26, was scheduled to take place in Glasgow. However, due to the global pandemic, it was postponed by a year, and instead, the Framework Convention it hosted a virtual climate dialogue to provide a platform for parties and other stakeholders to showcase progress and exchange ideas. What I want to do next is highlight some of the key milestone conferences and provide a necessary background for understanding where we are today with respect to this whole global fight against climate change. The first of the landmark conferences was COP3 in Kyoto, where the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated in 1997. The Kyoto Protocol was the first international treaty that committed countries to reduce CO2 emissions. These types of protocols specify how much different countries need to reduce their emissions, and these protocols outline the mechanism for implementation. For example, whether emissions can be traded between countries and what penalties apply when a country does not fulfill its commitment. So in the Kyoto Protocol, 37 industrialized nations and European Union the collective of the European Union agreed that by a target year between 2008 and 2012, that signatories would reduce their greenhouse gas emissions on average by 5.2% relative to a base year. And the base year was 1990 for most of the countries. Developing countries, on the other hand, did not have to commit to any emission reductions. This means that the Kyoto Protocol was based on the principle of a common but differentiated responsibility. So, in other words, it puts the onus of reducing current emissions on developed countries that were historically responsible for the current levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And those developed countries had already benefited from pumping all those CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. In total, 191 member countries signed and ratified the Kyoto Protocol. Now, let's take a quick look at the terms sign and ratify and look at what they mean for a treaty like the Kyoto Protocol to become legally binding. Countries send delegations of government representatives and professional negotiators to these conferences to negotiate these treaties on behalf of the individual countries. However, these delegations do not actually have the authority to make decisions or commit a country to a deal. In the news, you sometimes see prime ministers or presidents at these conferences, but this only happens during very specific times when things come down to the wire. So when the negotiations are done, so they've been talking back and forth and negotiations are finished, the delegations that were at the conference then take the treaties back to their home countries, and their government in power now have to officially sign the treaty to signal approval and commitment to what was negotiated. In Canada, this would be done by the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's cabinet. But in a democracy, the ultimate power is not with the government, but rather with the people that are represented by Parliament. And so before the government can take action, Parliament as a whole has to ratify the treaty. Now, exactly how this works depends on each country. But in Canada, of course, this is the House of Commons that has to ratify these international treaties before the government can start implementing what was negotiated in the treaty. Once the ratification has been done, then a country is fully committed to the international treaty. For a specific treaty, though, to become legally binding international law, a specific number of countries have to ratify the overall treaty. The exact rules for this depend on the treaty, but this ensures that the treaty has sufficient international support to be meaningful. The United Nations has close to 200 sovereign member states, and if the treaty is only signed by a handful of them, then that treaty would not be very meaningful. The Kyoto Protocol was negotiated in December of 1997, but it took until 2005 for enough countries to ratify the treaty and for it to become international law. So you can see that these processes can take a long time. In total, the Kyoto Protocol was ratified by 191 of the 193 countries of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So who were the two outsiders that didn't sign on? The first outsider country was South Sudan, who never signed the protocol. The second outsider country was the United States, which initially signed the protocol under the Clinton administration, but the US Senate never ratified it. The issue they had with the protocol was that the agreement did not require developing countries to commit to emission reductions, and they thought that the treaty would seriously harm the US economy. The situation in Canada was a bit special, but not much better. Canada signed and ratified the Kyoto Protocol under the Liberal government of Jean Chrétien. However, in December of 2011, the Conservative government under Stephen Harper announced that Canada would withdraw from the treaty. At the time, the government had a strong focus on developing the oil sands in Alberta, and the 2009 emission levels were 17% higher than in 1990. So these emission levels in Canada were far away from the negative 6% target that Canada had committed to in the protocol. Peter Kent, Canada's Minister of Environment at the time, highlighted that the only way for Canada to avoid the financial penalties associated with not reaching their target was to withdraw from the treaty. The government promised to come up with a, quote, made in Canada solution, but did not actually ever deliver that. Now, what happened with the targets that countries committed to in the Kyoto Protocol, as looking at the agreement in general? The white bars that you see on this chart are the reduction targets of all the developed countries that committed to getting their emissions under control. The graph is a bit small, but if you look closely, you can see the minus 6% commitment here from Canada. Now, not all the white bars are negative. This is because these targets represent a balance between the emissions under the expected economic development with a business as usual scenario and whatever relative reduction a government was able to commit to. But overall, the targets added up to a reduction of 5.2% relative to 1990 levels, and the 1990 levels are indicated by the dashed red line. The black bars on this chart show what actually happened. It is the relative change of emissions from 1990 to the reference year of 2009, which is roughly in the middle of all the target years. And what you can see is that there, unfortunately, were very large discrepancies. There are a lot of black bars on the right side of the zero line, which indicates a large increase in CO2 emissions during that time period. There are also many bars on the left of the zero line, which indicate reductions, and some of them are very substantial. But when you look at this more closely, you can see that most of these countries are relatively small and were part of the former Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc before the USSR broke up in 1991. What followed for many of these countries were economically challenging times, which resulted in a drop of their greenhouse gas emissions. So the reductions you see here are much more related to large geopolitical changes rather than targeted efforts to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. I hope this overview of the Kyoto Protocol gives you a meaningful sense of what the objective of this treaty was and how successful or not successful it was. Now, depending on the country, the target year for the committed emission reductions was between 2008 and 2012. And as I mentioned before, negotiating and ratifying these international treaties can take a long time. At the COP conference in Montreal in 2005, the signatory states of the Kyoto Protocol agreed to take steps towards extending the life of the treaty beyond 2012, when it was supposed to expire, and to negotiate deeper cuts in greenhouse gas emissions. This was known as the Montreal Action Plan. You can see the pattern that these agreements are always named after the city where the negotiations took place. The next milestone that we will highlight is the Copenhagen Accord, which was signed at COP15 in 2009. There are many parts to this accord, but the item I want to highlight is that the accord recognizes, quote, the scientific view that the increase in global temperature should stay below 2 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial levels, end quote. So this is when the community defined what they actually mean with this idea of, quote, dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, end quote. And it is where the 2 degrees Celsius target that I'm sure you've heard of comes from. In 2011, at COP17 in Durban, South Africa, the community agreed on two key things. First, they agreed to develop a new legal binding emissions reduction deal that included all countries. So not only the developed nations, it also included the developing nations. And by 2015, they would include everybody, and then the new agreement would come into effect by 2020. The second key item is that the community adopted a management framework for a green climate fund. The idea was to raise 100 billion US dollars every year to help less developed countries adapt to the impacts of climate change. This highlighted an awareness and an acknowledgement that change is happening and that the richer countries that have benefited tremendously from the use of fossil fuels have a responsibility and obligation to help poorer countries to deal with the consequences of the climate change that was largely caused by the developed countries. So at this point, the structure for the Green Climate Fund was created, but no funds were actually collected at that point. COP18 in Doha happened the year after, and this was another significant milestone. Because you've been paying attention, you realize that the Kyoto Protocol was going to expire in 2012, and in Durban, the community agreed to negotiate a new deal by 2015 that would go into effect in 2020. So there was going to be a gap where there would be no agreement at all. To address this issue, the goal of the members of the Kyoto Protocol in 2012 was to negotiate an amendment to the treaty that would bridge this gap. So the members in Doha agreed on a second commitment period from 2013 to 2020 to bridge this gap between the old and the new deal. During this period, the participating industrialized nations committed to collectively reducing their emissions below 18% from 1990 levels. This would have been a substantial additional decrease in emissions from their original Kyoto commitment of 5.2% below 1990 levels by 2012. This is what the situation was in 2012 with the proposed Doha Agreement. The green countries represent industrialized member states that committed to emission reductions under both the original Kyoto Protocol and under the new Doha Amendment. The purple countries had targets in the first place, but did not commit to new targets in the Doha Amendment. The blue countries are developing countries that were signatories to the Kyoto Protocol, but did not have any emission reduction targets. This reflects the spirit of the Kyoto Protocol, which was the common but differentiated responsibility based on wealth and past benefits from greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the red country is the South Sudan that never signed the protocol. The US is orange because it never ratified the protocol, and Canada is yellow because it withdrew. So this was a situation in 2012. When you look at this map, it immediately pops out that the biggest emitters, the US and China, and some of the countries with quickly growing populations like India and Nigeria, did not have any targets. So this was definitely not enough for fighting climate change in a meaningful way, given that this is a global issue. For the Doha Amendment to go into effect, 3/4 of the member states had to ratify the agreement. Unfortunately, only 36 states did, which meant the amendment never went into force. Next, we go to 2015, when we had COP21 in Paris. There was significant pressure at this meeting because the parties had agreed in Durban in 2011 to have a legally binding new agreement by 2015, and the Doha Amendment had failed miserably. So the goals of the meeting in Paris were in part to negotiate a legally binding and universal amendment on climate, with the aim of keeping the global warming below 2 degrees Celsius. So in comparison to the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris meeting would have to have all countries to be included. So the stakes were very high at the conference. And the conference attracted close to 50,000 participants, including official delegates from governments, intergovernmental organizations like the World Bank or NATO, United Nations agencies, and non-government organizations or NGOs like Greenpeace or the David Suzuki Foundation. We actually had a graduate from the REM Master's Program in Paris who was participating in a conference with the David Suzuki Foundation. Now, what came out of the negotiations of the COP21 was the Paris Agreement, which was the first global agreement targeted at combating climate change. This agreement had three main goals. The first goal is to hold the increase on the average global temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius based on pre-industrial levels. So they wanted to hold it 2 degrees below the levels, 2 degrees Celsius below the temperature of pre-industrial levels, and pursue efforts to keep the overall degrees below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So they affirmed their commitment to the targets of the Copenhagen Accord and then made it even more ambitious because that's what was required. The second goal is to increase the world's ability to adapt to the adverse effects of climate change and to foster resilience. These 2 points highlight the main approaches for dealing with climate change, which are mitigation and adaptation. So let's take a look at these two strategies in more detail. Mitigation refers to all actions that reduce the intensity of global warming. So this includes efforts to reduce emissions or to create new sinks for greenhouse gases to absorb those gases. Example for this are reforestation initiatives because forests hold carbon, or other approaches are to look at carbon capture and storage programs that suck CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it in geological structures to permanently remove it from the atmosphere. Other management strategies is adaptation. And so this side focuses on minimizing the societal effects of the expected change due to climate. So in other words, it's more about reducing the society's vulnerability and increasing its resilience. Here are some examples of adaptation measures. Very simple and short-term things like building boardwalks in Arctic villages to deal with the thawing of the permafrost, or Swiss ski resorts covering up glaciers with white blankets during the summer months to slow down the melting. More substantial mitigation measures are things like Pacific Islanders moving to higher ground, or even purchasing land in other countries to escape sea level rise, and the development of more resilient crops that can handle warmer and drier climate. So these are some very basic examples of possible adaptation strategies, but there were and continue to be many more strategies. The Paris Agreement acknowledges that we need both mitigation and adaptation. We need mitigation to keep climate change as low as possible, but we also need to adapt to the changes that are already coming along. The smaller we can keep the change, so the better we can implement mitigation, then the less we need to use adaptation. The third goal of the Paris Agreement is to make financial flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. This highlights the necessity of the Green Climate Fund and explicitly states that we need to put our money where our mouth is. Now, the agreement in Paris was negotiated in December of 2015, and what you see on this slide is when some of the largest global emitters signed and ratified the agreement. Canada, which is responsible for about 2% of the global emissions, signed the agreement on April 22nd, 2016, and ratified it on October 5th of that same year. On November 4th, 2016, enough countries had ratified the Paris Agreement that it went into effect. The necessary condition was that at least 55 countries had to ratify, and at least 55% of the global emissions had to be covered by these countries. And so the Paris Agreement became the first global agreement for dealing with climate change in a global united way. Unfortunately, that's not where it ended. In 2017, President Trump announced that the United States would be withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, arguing that it is economically unfair to the US. Now, nations cannot just withdraw from these agreements overnight. It's actually quite the opposite, as the procedures for withdrawing are quite lengthy. So, on August 4th, 2017, the US gave formal notice, and on November 4th, 2020, 4 years after the agreement went into effect, the United States officially withdrew from the Paris Agreement and is no longer at the negotiating table. After the 2020 election, then Joe Biden, of course, won the presidency, and in his first few days of office, he re-signed on back, or actually withdrew their withdrawal, meaning that the United States is back into the Paris Agreement. That brings us to today. So let's briefly recap the sequence of events. The Kyoto Protocol was negotiated at COP3, 1997. In Montreal at COP11 in 2005, the community decided to work towards extending the Kyoto Protocol. At COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009, the 2-degree target was defined. In 2011, at COP17 in Durban, the signatory nations of the Kyoto Protocol agreed to prepare a new deal by 2015 to go into effect by 2020. At the same time, they also created the infrastructure for the Green Climate Fund. The year after Doha, at COP18, the Doha Amendment was negotiated to create a bridge between the Kyoto Protocol and the New Deal, but the effort failed because not enough members ratified the amendment. And finally, at COP21 in Paris in 2015, the parties negotiated the Paris Agreement, which went into effect on November 4th, 2016. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the key players at these conferences are government delegates. So it is the professional diplomats and negotiators, not climate scientists, negotiating these deals. On the other hand, it makes sense as a lot more than just climate needs to be considered when making these deals. At the same time, these people need to have a good understanding of how their decisions are related to climate. So where do the negotiators and the delegates get their information from? This is where the IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, comes in. The IPCC was established in 1988 by the United Nations Environmental Programme and the World Meteorological Organization, the WMO. The purpose of the IPCC is to review and assess the most recent scientific, technical, and socioeconomic information on climate change. It's key to note that the mandate of the IPCC is to provide neutral and balanced scientific information to decision makers, and that information that is relevant for their decision-making process. So the role of the IPCC is simply to provide the facts and then let the decision makers work with it. The IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, consists of 3 working groups and 1 task force that focuses on different aspects of climate change. Working Group 1 focuses on the physical science of climate change. So here you have climatologists, glaciologists, oceanographers, and climate modelers. The second working group examines the effects of climate change and how society can adapt to them. The third and final working group examines climate change mitigation. So how can we reduce the severity of climate change by either adopting meaningful policies or developing technical solutions like carbon capture and storage? Here again, you can see the distinction between mitigation and adaptation. The task force develops guidelines for creating national greenhouse gas inventories. If we want nations to reduce their emissions and keep those nations accountable, then we need to have a meaningful way to monitor each country's emissions. Now, all of these working groups are made up of researchers and university professors who contribute to the IPCC on side of their regular jobs. There are several SFU profs who have been or are currently part of these working groups. So, for example, Mark Jackard from REM is currently a member, and Christian Zickfeld from Geography. Now, about every 5 years, the working groups publish a large assessment report, or a whole series of reports, that summarize the latest scientific evidence about climate change and its management in the 3 areas. In addition to the comprehensive reports, the groups also produce a synthesis report for decision makers, where the really key information is summarized in a way that non-scientists can understand and use the information. The first set of assessment reports was published in 1990, and the most recent set, the 5th assessment report, was published in 2013 and 2014 in preparation for the COP meeting in Paris. The 6th assessment report is scheduled to be published in 2021. A quick side note, in 2007, the IPCC, together with Al Gore, the former Vice President of the United States under Bill Clinton, won the Nobel Peace Prize for, quote, their efforts to build up and disseminate greater knowledge about man-made climate change and to lay the foundations for the measures that are needed to counteract such change, end quote. In addition to the regularly released assessment reports, the IPCC also publishes special reports on specific topics. For example, in response to the goals stated in the Paris Agreement, the IPCC published a report that examined what would actually take place to limit, or what would be required to take place to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2018. As you can read on this slide, it will take substantial actions. The report states, quote, global net human-caused emissions of CO2 would need to fall by about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030. That's only 10 years from now, reaching net zero around 2050, end quote. I hope this lecture has given you a good overview of the key players and processes in the global climate change politics and what role scientists play. So let's briefly summarize how this all fits together. On the left side, we have peer-reviewed science, which provides the foundation for our understanding of climate change. And on the right, we have national governments that represent the people and make decisions. In between these two, we have 2 critical institutions, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. National governments propose experts for the different working groups of the IPCC. And then they summarize the latest research on the different aspects of climate change and publish it in assessment reports. Governments then review the assessment reports before those reports are published. Next, governments also send delegations to the annual conferences of the parties, the COPs, which are organized under the Framework Convention. We talked about a number of these meetings, so all you really need to know about are the main milestones of each. The negotiations at the COP meetings or Council of Party meetings are informed by the assessment reports that were prepared by the IPCC, but the reports are neutral and do not prescribe any particular policy decisions. The delegations take this information into consideration when negotiating treaties, such as the Kyoto Protocol, the Doha Amendment, or the Paris Agreement. These treaties specify emission targets and other commitments for the member countries and define processes for how to monitor and enforce the agreements. The treaties are then signed and ratified by national governments, and then they become legally binding international law once enough governments have signed and ratified the agreements. Governments then work towards their commitments by implementing climate action policies and keeping track of their greenhouse gas emissions. The Framework Convention then monitors countries' progress and, if possible and necessary, enforces the targets with the methods described in the treaty. This schematic highlights nicely the key players in international climate change politics and how they interact with each other. In our upcoming climate conference simulation, you will experience firsthand how challenging these negotiations can be and how difficult it is to come up with a meaningful treaty that can be supported by everyone. So that ends our introduction into climate change politics. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.